Kia ora koutou. Today we're going to be looking at the 1.3 practice exam, the first practice exam from Westlake Girls High School. The best thing to do here is to have a go at each question yourself and then come back and listen to what I have to say. I'm going to talk about what you should think about for each question and give you a few possible solutions that you might write down. If you're really stuck, then listen first, but really try and get the questions done yourself first and then listen to what I have to say. So let's have a look at the first question. The first question, it tells you to look at resource figure 1. Sorry, resource book 1 is up there, and then it says refer to figure 1. So if we look in our resource book, we've got figure 1 here, and I can just zoom that in a bit. So figure 1, it's a scatter graph. So the first thing I'm thinking about with a scatter graph is, can I put a line of best fit, is what we call it on there, a line of best fit. So that's a line that kind of looks like it goes through the middle of the data, and you should use a ruler to do that, and it should have about half the data above and about half the data below, something like that. Yours might not be exactly the same as mine, but you want something close to that. Once I see that, I'm also looking at my scales, and there's something interesting about the scale. The EQI, the equity index, it's got 344 on the right hand side and 569 on the left hand side. So this scale is unusual in that it is getting less as it goes down. The vertical axis is about attainment rate. It's got 100% at the top and 0% at the bottom. So I've sort of got my head around what this is now telling us. Also, we've got these red lines out to the side, or these red dots. That's a bit unusual. And when I look at the dots in the middle, I see some are purple and some are blue. So I'm looking at the bottom here. It tells me blue is state schools, purple is integrated schools, and the red schools are private schools. Using some of my knowledge that I have about schools, which we all do, private schools tend to be where the rich students are. And if we read about equity index numbers, it says a higher EQI number indicates that a school has students facing more socioeconomic barriers on average, and a lower EQI number indicates a school has students facing fewer socioeconomic barriers on average. So a lower EQI number, like 344, suggests that the student comes from a family that has lots of money or few socioeconomic barriers, as put above. So that's your private school students. So I think that we can ignore anything about those private school students unless we get a specific question about it. So if we look at the question is asking us, if a school has a middle equity index around 513, what would its NCEA level 3 attainment be? So we're saying, where is 513 on this on the scale along the bottom here? 513, somewhere along there. You can kind of guess it somewhere in the middle if you want, but I'm not going to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go 569 in my calculator minus 513. That's 56. So the gap here is 56. And the total distance, 569 minus 344, is 225. So 56 divided by 225 tells me how far along the scale I should be. It's actually about 25% of the way along. So if I look at my scale from here to here, halfway is there, 25% is there. So I think that is where about 513 is. Now all I need to do to work out from there is I need to draw a line straight up from there till it intersects with my line of best fit, and then from there do one straight across to where it intersects with that axis there, and then I need to see how far up that axis is it. And according to what I've drawn there, I think 513 is somewhere about 20%, maybe 25%. If I think about that scale, if this is the top and the bottom, halfway would be about here. That's about quarter. That's about quarter. I make that about 20%. So back on my answers, I'm simply going to write approximately 20%. The answer schedule, when I've just looked at it, actually says um, use the trend line to find the attainment rate to be about 25%. Uh, it's interesting that it doesn't ask you to show how you've done that. It would be good to be able to hand that resource booklet in with that detail on there. Let's go and have a look at the second question. So the second part of this is describe and interpret at least two different features of the relationship shown. So I want to be thinking whenever I'm looking at a, a, a graph like this, I want to think, is it a strong relationship? Is it a weak relationship? Is it a moderate relationship? I think it's probably a pretty moderate relationship. I want to think, is it linear or not? It looks linear to me. I can draw a straight line through it. And I also want to look at it and say, can I see, is it positive or negative? Now, normally we would say this is a positive relationship with the gradient going uphill like it is at the moment. But because of our negative scale at the bottom, this is actually a negative gradient. It's a little bit of a tricky one with that. So I would go back to my exam paper and I would write, there is a moderate negative linear relationship. That's the mathematical context of this. I'm also going to do it in the context of the actual question. So using bullet points so that I'm arranging my thinking, I've written in real words what this means. So the lower the EQI, the higher the attainment. That's the real words of it. So the lower the EQI, the higher the NCEA Level 3 attainment. What other features can we see different, at least two different features of the relationship? So that's showing the relationship. We could also look at a few things about the way the data is shaped. So I can see that the spread of the data, if I look in the higher part of the graph there, or that quarter there, things are pretty close together, but lower down, the spread is bigger. So where the EQI is higher, the data is more spread. So I can simply write that as a statement. We can also write a statement about the private schools there because we pretty much ignored that. Although when I read the question again, I can see the question specifically talks about state integrated schools, so we're not going to do that. So that's probably enough there. In actual fact, what we've done is we've listed uh, three things about the relationship here, and in our second bullet point, we've done it in words as well. Sorry, in the context. So we've done mathematically and in the context, and we've done something about the spread of the data. So that's probably enough for this question. When we're doing these kind of questions, we always want to be thinking mathematically and in the context of the question and making sure we've got that covered, and then look at the spread of the data. And then we can look at if there's any unusual points. So moving on to the next question. So this is a claim that Year 13 students with lower EQI have a higher percentage who gain in CEA. It doesn't in this particular question distinguish between state integrated schools and private schools. So we need to make sure we include a statement about that in here. So the first thing that I'm going to write, and I'm going to use bullet points like I did before, is basically looking at the relationship that we've already covered, but I'm going to qualify that by saying that it's in state and integrated schools. So that's basically the same statement we had before. In state and integrated schools, as EQI decreases, the level 3 attainment tends to increase. I'm now going to write a similar statement, but it's going to be about the private schools. So in private schools, the EQI is 344 for all schools, so it doesn't have a relationship with level 3 attainment. You could potentially write that many of the schools have high attainment as well, but really there's not enough information on the graph for that. We can write a comment about the scatter. So saying that the scatter is higher for, or sorry, larger for the higher EQI schools could make the data less reliable. We haven't actually said though we haven't actually said whether or not the claim is supported. And in the question, it does say evaluate the claim. So I'm going to now write the claim can be supported, or the claim is supported. The next part of this is discuss any potential limitations. So this is really a key point for excellence. What I've written so far would probably get you a merit mark on this question, but we need to talk about limitations of this data for excellence. So when I look at the graph has a few things. That the scale is not clear. That's a potential limitation. But I'm going to read the text again, and I can see that in the text it says this is the attainment data for all school leavers. And this could potentially be a different graph if we looked at just year 13s, because all school leavers would include year 12 students. So I'm going to write a statement about that. So I've written that in a sentence, and I've also said what the implication of that is. So the graph could be different if it was just for year 13s. One other limitation that we could potentially look at is that we don't know where the schools are from around the country, and we also don't know anything about the school's sizes, so we could write statements on that. And the reason that's kind of interesting information and a limitation is we could think about the fact that we know that different parts of New Zealand have different socioeconomic barriers. Some areas are richer than others, so you could potentially write a statement in there. One of the key things I've done here, if you look at everything I've written, is all of it is bullet points. We want to make sure that the marker can easily see what our thinking is. We want to guide them to what we're doing. So I've also written that there is a limitation and other limitations, so they can see that I've stopped talking about the data itself and I've started talking about the limitations of the data. We really want the marker to be to be reading it in the same way that we thought of it as we wrote it down. Right, let's go on to question 2. So in order to make a recommendation, we need to look at the table they've given us. And we probably need to do some calculations here. So we need to get our head around how this table is working. Each university has different rates per week or per year. You see University A is per year, University B and C are per week. They have different deposit amounts. And they have different durations out on the right hand side here. So for the per week, if we look at University B, it's not quite as long as University A or C. The other thing, if we look at the question, it doesn't actually say that it has to be based solely on money. So this column here about the walking distance to campus potentially is something that we want to be thinking of, because it might be that we want to make a statement about that. So I've kind of got my head around what it says here. Also, in the meals column, that 3 meals are included for University B. For University A, 2 meals are included, but you've got to pay $15 for the third meal. And for University C, 3 meals you can get them, but you have to pay an extra 2.5% of the yearly cost. So I'm going to use all of that information to do some calculations. I'm just going to set up a little table in order to do that here. So now I'm going to fill this in with what we know. So for University A, it's very straightforward. The rate for the year is 18,400. Now for University C, it's 4,700 times the 40 weeks. So do that in my calculator, which is $19,080. University B is going to be 490 times 38 weeks plus 6/7 of 490, because it's 6/7 of the last week. So let's put that in our calculator as well. So that's $19,040. Uh, the meals for University B are included, so we don't need to put anything into there. The meals for University A are included for 2 meals, but not for the third meal. So we need to do a calculation for that. So that's going to be $15 per day for the 40 weeks that they're there. So 15 times 7 times 40. And the meals for University C, 2.5% of the cost of the year. So that's going to be 0.025 times 19,080, which is an extra $477. So my totals, when I add those up, are, so there's the totals there, and I've written out to the right hand side the deposit amounts. It's not clear whether the deposit amounts are on top of the yearly rate or included, but normally a deposit rate is included in the rate, so they shouldn't make a big difference. So now I need to make some decisions. I need to give a recommendation for Anahera and justify it. So I'm going to look at two things here. I'm going to look at the cost, and I'm also going to look at that walking distance, which I put an arrow on over here. So cost-wise, we can see quite clearly that University B is better by a little over $500 from University C. But if we look at the walking distance, University B has a 20-minute walk and University C has a 5-minute walk. So I'm going to make a couple of statements that say exactly those sort of things. So I've written those statements there. If we go back and read the question, it does say explain any assumptions. So some of the assumptions that I've done is that the deposit is included in the total, and also I've assumed that Anahera will buy all of the 3 meals each day. So I'm going to write a couple of statements about that. You could also have assumptions in any valid one. So we've talked about the distance that they've got to walk. So you could write something about assuming that Anahera will walk each day. You could potentially have an assumption about that Anahera will stay at university for the entire year because given that B and C are weekly payments, potentially if she dropped out partway through, then University A could be better. But you're basically looking for any assumptions there, and you can use some information that you know yourself outside of the maths exam. The next question. So the first question here is sort of about, can you see if there's misleading information on the graph? So every time we look at a graph, the first thing we're doing is we're getting our head around what is shown on the graph. So in this graph here, we've got these strips, each one adds up to 100%, and it's showing the living arrangements for tertiary students from the census 2018. And each one has a dark blue, then an orange, then a grey, the dark blue, then red, then grey, then an orange or yellow, then a light blue, and then a green. But when I look down the bottom, we've only got 4 things in the key for the graph. So what we don't know is what is the dark blue or the dark green. That's pretty misleading because is this information presented clearly? No, it's not, because we have no idea what those things represent. And they could be key. It could be interesting or useful for what a question might ask us. Now, something else with this question is because it's a pretty open question, I kind of wonder, is this an achieved a merit or an excellence question? But if I look at the question, they've given us just 4 lines to answer it on. Anytime they give you just 4 lines to answer something on, you can be pretty sure that's going to be an achieved question, and normally one statement is enough for that. So the next one, discussing other ways in which the data could be displayed and advantages or disadvantages of each method. So you need to be thinking about other graph types that could be displaying this data. So for this, you could think about different ways we could do this. For each strip, we could potentially do a pie graph. That would work. The advantage of that is it's really, really easy to see the percentages. The disadvantage is that you would need to have 4 different pie graphs. Another way we could do it is using comparative bar graphs, but you would probably need to have um, 4 or 6 comparative bar graphs to make that work. You could have a table, which could be confusing, but the data would be, you could have all of the data represented without missing anything in a single table. So there's several different ways there. Really what this question is asking you to do is, can you come up with another graph type? Can you list what it is and what some of the advantages and disadvantages are? So I'm just going to write one example answer, but you could do 2 or 3 for this. And when I look at the space here, I can see that there's quite a bit of space given to answer it. So I would be saying go for at least 2 different ways of doing this one. So that's one example answer there, and I've left some space for where I would do the comparative bar graph in here and the table in there with some advantage and disadvantage of each. You could lay that out however you want, but you want to make it really clear for the marker what your thinking is. So that's question 2 done. Let's go to question 3. So question 3 tells us to use figure 3. Before I even read the rest of it, I often just like to go and have a look straight at it. Figure 3. So here's figure 3 here. Figure 3 is a time series graph. I can see that it starts at 1998, it finishes at 2024. It has just one time series trace on it, which is New Zealand's gender pay gap. It's starting up here at about 16.3%, finishes down here at what looks about 8.25%. And in general, it is going downhill. The trend over time is that it's decreasing. I can also see there's some interesting things here. There was a spike in 2005, and it's pretty inconsistent from 2012 through to 2018. And in fact, from 2012 to 2022, it remains almost flat with these spikes here in 2013, 2015, 2016. It's particularly flat from 2017 to 2022 in this space here. So there's lots and lots of things there that I find interesting when I'm looking at it, which may be of use depending on what the question is that's being asked. So I've just removed all of those markings I just did as I explained that, and let's have a look at the question itself. Now it turns out the question is actually asking us to write down exactly what I just talked about. So I'm going to put some of those statements down in writing here. Notice that it uses words just before I do, like trends, repeating patterns, unusual features. These are things we're always looking for. And it says provide evidence from the graph. So that means use some numbers in your answers. But we should always be using numbers in our answers anyway. I've just written my statement about the long-term trend. I'm actually going to calculate what the gradient as well, because that's a useful thing to do when we're talking about the trend. So when I go back to my graph, I can see I said 16.3 there and 8.25 there, and that's from 2024 to 1998, so that's over 26 years. So it drops 16.005 is the rise, and 26 is the run. So in my calculator, I can put 8.05 divided by rise over run. The run I said was 26, so I get 0.31, and it's going downhill from there to there. That's a downhill gradient, so 0.31 negative, or dropping about 0.31%. So I can put that in a statement, which makes my long-term trend just have a bit more meaning. So it's a calculation of the gradient and then a sentence in the context of the question. So you can see here I've written down the things that I talked about. In the question it mentioned repeating patterns up here. I haven't really mentioned repeating patterns, and in the tips and tricks document I wrote last week, I didn't do that either, but we talk about them being cyclical, or if it's something that repeats in seasons, and we could talk about seasonal. So if you see a spike in summer for seasonal time series data, but you can just talk about them as being repeated patterns. You'll see I've just used bullet points. Bullet points are always a good idea. Like I keep saying, you want to make the marker think the same way you were thinking. So each bullet point represents one single idea. And for this question, they didn't give a lot of space. I would suggest in the exam, this question would potentially have a bit more space because it does read like an excellence question. And when I check the marking schedule, I can see that it is. All right, on to the next question. So this question asks us about figure 4. So if we go and look at figure 4, it's got the men's and women's median hourly earnings by ethnicity and gender pay gaps within ethnicity from June 2024. So we've got each ethnicity along the bottom, and it tells us that the light purple is the men and the dark purple is the women. So this is median hourly earnings and gender pay gaps. So I'm looking at this and I'm sort of thinking, what have we got here? First of all, there's red dots all the way along it. And I can't for the life of me work out what those red dots are. There's a chance in your exam you'll be given a graph that has information that isn't made clear. Um, if that happens, you're just going to have to ignore it. So in this case, we're going to ignore the red dots. I can see here that for each graph, for each ethnicity, I should say, we can see that the men is higher than the women's median hourly earnings. We can see that the gap is bigger here in the European one, and here for total ethnicity. We can see for Māori and Pacific, it's a little less, and it's kind of a moderate gap here for the Asian and for the MELAA. So let's have a look at what the question is asking us to do. It says, do men tend to have higher median hourly earnings compared to women? And justify your answer with statistical reasoning. Just note here, you've been given a lot of lines to write your answer on. So this is likely to be at least a merit question. So a one statement is not enough on this case. So first of all, we need to take the position, do men tend to have higher median hourly earnings compared to women? If we look at this graph, we can see that in each graph, men have higher earnings, and in the total ethnic group area, which you would assume is aggregating the whole lot, that men have higher earnings. So I think we can write that our answer is yes. So the first thing is we're going to take a position, and now we need to write some statements to support that. And again, I would be thinking that you should use some bullet points, because using bullet points organizes your thinking, makes sure that the marker is following your thinking. It also means that if you're writing more than one idea, you're writing those ideas separately. They're not running into each other in a paragraph. So I'm going to show you a couple of things I'm going to write here. So I've written a couple of statements here. The first one is basically an overall statement saying that in all the ethnicities, men have a higher median hour earnings than women. And then I've looked at the ethnicities individually, and I've said that I believe that the European gap here is biggest, and I've just estimated looking over here that that's about $4. And then I've looked at the Māori one, sorry, the Pacific one, and said that looks the smallest there. And looking over the scale there, I think that's about $1. So those are just estimated values. If you have a ruler with you in your exam, it makes that a whole lot easier to do those estimations. And I've also made a statement about the total ethnic group gap is approximately $3. Now we can also say a statement that potentially doesn't support what we've said, but is an interesting thing to note. You don't want to write something that means that the fact that I've said yes up here is completely negated. But if I've got something that is worthwhile mentioning, then you should do that. In this case, it's the fact that if we look at the Māori earnings and the European earnings, we can see that the women in the European ethnicity actually have higher earnings than the Māori do. So we can see here that the European gap, sorry, the European women is about $33 and the Māori men is about $30. So we can make a comment about that as well. So a simple statement saying that just be a little bit careful when you're writing something like that. Like I say, you don't want to make it so that the position that you took on the question becomes untrue. So on to the what I think is the last question. So this question is all about sampling practices. If we have a look, they've given you a whole lot of information about that household survey, and it actually asks us to look at Figure 3 and Figure 4. It says that those graphs were taken from the Stats New Zealand Household Labour Force Survey. It's key there that we can see that's approximately 30,000 respondents, and it collects information each year. So is the survey a reliable method to determine the gender pay gap? Discuss any potential limitations or assumptions. So there's a bunch of things here we could talk about. First of all, the number of participants is really good. So it's 15,000 households and approximately 30,000 participants across those households. And if a household is taking part in it, that's got some rules around who has to do that. So it says everyone aged over 15, and everyone in the household will be interviewed every 3 months. It says that it uses a fair statistical method. Doesn't tell us what that fair statistical method is, but it is done by Statistics New Zealand, which is a government agency, so you can have some trust in that. So those are some good things about that. So we could write those as bullet points as reasons why we can trust this. It also asks us to discuss any potential limitations or assumptions. So in the document there, it tells us that if you move away from a house, they won't contact you at the new address. It'll be replaced by the new occupants. So those new occupants could have significantly different employment and income. So that's a limitation of it. Another limitation could be that people don't actually tell the truth. They don't want to share their details. And as I mentioned before, we know that it's a fair statistical method, but it doesn't tell us what that statistical method is. So that's a limitation. They should tell us those things. So I'm going to write some bullet points on that. So that's that stuff written there. So that brings us to the end of this exam paper. I guess the key points are make sure you use bullet points every time you're answering with multiple statements. You want to keep the marker's thinking the same way as yours, and you want to keep your ideas really, really clear. Make sure that you're giving more than one idea, particularly when they give you lots and lots of lines to write on. That's an indication that you need to do 2 or 3. If you think it's an excellence question, probably 3 answers per question. Make sure that you check that you're not just answering the question, like in this one here, but you're also seeing, does it talk about the limitations and assumptions? Because for excellence, if you need to give limitations and assumptions and you haven't, you will only get a merit for that question. Thank you. See ya.